Hey guys, this is Mike from Eldorado Guitars, and today I want to talk with you about two of my favorite amps, the Naylor Super Drive 60 and the Friedman Naked. Okay, so the title of this video is the Friedman Naked, what is it and why does it exist? And you're probably wondering why we're talking about a Naylor. Well, the reason is the Naylor Super Drive is the foundation for the Naked. So in order to understand the Naked and kind of why it exists and what is special about it, you have to understand the Naylor Super Drive 60. So the Naylor Super Drive 60 is an amp that was created, I believe, in the 90s by, I think his name is Joe Naylor, and he was living in Michigan. Those are where the OG Naylors are from. I used to own an OG Naylor, and I'll make a comparison for you later based on my thoughts and stuff. But basically, it was a boutique amp company designed to provide sort of Marshall style amps, but like a bit different, right? A different power section, a very different feel, and a very different kind of more wild sort of sound. They were loved by many, kind of artists in the 90s, but the most notorious one is probably Billy Howerdel of A Perfect Circle. That's what everybody kind of knows the Naked as, right? It's the Billy Howerdel amp. But the Billy Howerdel amp starts with a Naylor. So Billy had a Naylor Super Drive 60 in the 90s that he really liked. But it was a really dark amp, right? And I'll show you in a second how you have to do a little bit to get this amp going. But the amp is very dark, right? Very, very dark. And while the amp sounds really good in like standard tuning or maybe E flat, if you're doing what Billy Howerdel does and tuning all the way down to C sharp standard, the amp is just too dark. It's too dark, it's too mushy, and it just really isn't tight enough is the bottom line, right? It's not tight enough. Now you might be thinking like, well, yeah, Mike, but why didn't he just put a pedal in front of it like you do with a dual rectifier, right? I've got my little green bonsai right here, right? And the answer is, when you put a pedal in front of an amp, it tends to change the feel of the amp a bit, right? And Billy Howerdel has this very particular sound that's like almost like a hard to play kind of sound, right? It's a very scratching, clawing, stiff kind of sound. And if you put a boost in front of the Naylor, it becomes more liquid, right? You lose the feel, right? So he didn't want to boost the amp. So instead, he decided to go to Dave Friedman, right? The Wizard of Dave, right? Who had done a lot of work on Naylors in the 90s, which I can talk more about later. And basically said, yo, Dave, I love this Naylor amp. I love the preamp, but like I can't get that Marshall-y kind of sound out of it that, it needs more Marshall DNA. It needs to be brighter. It needs to be tighter. Like, can you work your magic on it, right? And that is how the Naked was born, right? It was a Marshall that, an old Marshall from the late 70s, I believe, that Dave, the OG Naked, right, is a late 70s Marshall super lead that Dave modified with a Naylor preamp and the Marshall power section. And that's exactly what you've got in the Naked, okay? The Naylor, on the other hand, is very different. The Super Drive is only 60 watts, hence Super Drive 60, and it's not a Marshall power section. The power section is kind of its own thing, and it's powered by 5881 tubes, which you might be familiar with from amp makers like Soldano. So the amp itself is extremely dark. It's a 2-channel amp. There's a high and a low input, just like on old Marshalls. The low input is extremely clean. I'll play it for you for a second so you can hear it. It's very, very, very low gain. It's like a pedal platform, right? So let's check it out. So as you can hear, it won't break up at all, right? It's just a very, very, very clean, low output sound, right? So very cool, but not really what we're going to talk about in this video. So let's go back to the high input. I have everything set at noon. Presence, bass, mid, treble, volume, gain, and the byte switch is off. And this is the sound of the Naylor Super Drive 60 with everything at noon. Very dark amp, right? Even when I dug in like that to try and make a really bright snapping sound, it just didn't happen, right? So the Naylor is voiced very, very, very dark. So the first thing you usually do with most nailers is jack the presence. And I had to do that on my old Michigan one and on this newer one from 2022, right? So let's go ahead and turn up the presence. I'm just gonna strum a chord and you're gonna hear the presence value change. Now it sounds a lot better, right? So that's usually the first thing you have to do with most nailers. If you ever see a Super Drive, like in a studio, or like sometimes I'll see photos of it online or something, everybody's presence control is at 10, all right? So that's the first thing you have to do. Second thing I feel like you have to do with the nailer is turn the bite switch up. With the bite switch down, even though that's a pretty good sound, and I could probably like increase my treble to actually get a pretty decent sound. Well, I'll do that real quick for you, just so you can hear it. So not a bad sound, but it's like kind of, to me at least anyways, it's just like missing a little something, right? It's really just missing something. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the treble back at noon. I'll play you the basic sound again. And now I'm gonna turn on the bite switch. So it just gives it like some upper mid-range and some additional harmonic content. Frankly, with the bite switch up, it makes it sound much more like a Marshall. That's really the bottom line, right? It makes it sound much more like a Marshall. So I usually leave the presence at 10 all the time, and I usually leave the bite switch up all the time, pretty much, unless I'm going for a specific sound, right? All right. The next thing about the nailer that's important to understand is the gain control. So the gain control in this amp is, like most amps, very important. And the sound of the amp will change quite a bit depending upon where the gain is set. So like if I lower the gain, for example, to like a quarter, a little bit brighter, but since it's the amp is so hard to play, it's really difficult to use that lower gain setting for classic rock, to be honest. Like it actually kind of makes it difficult. So the secret, I think, is to actually turning the gain up. Before we were at noon, so we were about here. That's really more of like a classic rock thing, right? But the cool part about the nailer is that as I turn the gain up, the voice of the amp is going to shift a little bit to something much more modern sounding. Listen. All of a sudden it seems like the amp just like woke up, right? And so that's what I mean when I say like the gain control is very important, right, on the amp. Now one other thing you generally have to do with nailers is turn the treble up a lot. On my old Michigan era nailer, I had to turn the treble up to like 3/4 to get it to sound pretty good. I suspect what they're doing now is probably using a different value of treble pot. I don't think the circuit is different because the new owners of Naylor, David King, told me that it's the same exact circuit. But what I suspect is going on is they probably are using a different value treble pot so that you have the ability to kind of like go past where the old value was because you had to turn it up so high. So let's go ahead and check that out. I'm going to bring the treble up just a little as I play here. So you can hear the beginnings of the Billy Howardell sound there, right? It sounds a lot more like Perfect Circle now, right? So you can definitely hear kind of like the beginnings of the Billy Howardell thing, right? The sound, right? But it's almost like a more vintage version of the sound, right? And it sounds really good with standard tuning, right? So I'm in standard tuning right now, and the amp sounds awesome, right? I mean, it sounds great. But if you're doing what Billy Howardell was doing, he was tuning his guitar down, right? Down from standard all the way to C sharp. And this is a 25.5-inch scale guitar. Billy is doing it with a Les Paul, right? So a 24.75 scale. So like a much looser feel. There's going to be a lot of like sub frequencies and stuff that like the Naylor is just going to turn to mush, right? And your options in order to make it brighter are very limited because the presence is already jacked. The bite switch is already on, the treble's already up pretty high, the gain's already up pretty high, right? So like really you're running out of room on this amp, right? Like you're running out of room to EQ, you know? Enter the Friedman Naked, right? This is the use case for the Naked. This is why the Naked exists because the Naylor's awesome, but it's dark. And it really only works with like standard tuned guitars or maybe an E flat guitar, right? But when you start getting down to C sharp or D or B or whatever, it's just going to be all mush. And you don't want to add a boost because you don't want to change the feel and that kind of harder to play under the finger feel because it's part of the sound. Some people call it sticky. Some people say that the Naylor's, that Super Drive kind of has like a sticky sort of feel, right? And I think that that's true, right? Kind of like I said, like a Wizard or something, right? That is why the Friedman Naked exists. So we're going to switch over amps here to the Friedman Naked. I'll see you guys in just a minute, and then you'll be able to understand and appreciate what's going on with the Naked. I'll cover what's different about the Naked. We'll go through some sounds, and then you can do a comparison between the two, and at the end, I'll give you my final thoughts. Thanks, everybody. See you in just a minute. Okay, everybody, we are back with the Friedman Naked fired up and ready to rumble. Now that we understand why this amp exists, like what the use case is for this amp, hopefully it makes a lot more sense to you. And now you can kind of hear it in action and get to check it out on your own. So there's a couple of important differences between this amp and the Super Drive, just from a technical perspective, right? So one is wattage. So the Super Drive is 60 watts, the Naked is 100 watts. The second is the type of power tubes. The Naylor runs on 5881 power tubes, and the Naked runs on EL34. Remember, Marshall power section, right? There is some difference in switching options. So this is a full 2-channel amp, whereas if you recall in this one, it's kind of a 2-channel amp, but you've got to switch between the inputs, right? This one, it's all in one, so you can do clean. There's a clean channel and a gain channel. The simple clean channel is pretty basic. It's just one knob. It has a 3-way bright switch, and that's really it. I mean, nothing super crazy. It sounds pretty distorted on a full pickup. Here's what it sounds like on the neck pickup. If you split it, it sounds a little better. So, you know, it's serviceable, but it's not great, right, is what I would say. Like, it's okay. It works a lot better with lower output guitars, so you could actually get a pretty decent clean tone out of it with, like, a Strat or, you know, maybe a P90 equipped guitar, right, or something like that, right? You can get some better clean sounds out of it, but with the high output humbuckers like this, it's not really going to be super clean, right? It's just going to kind of just be enough to get the job done, and, like, that's really it, right? Okay. On the gain channel, there's some important differences too. Remember, on this amp, we had the bite switch and everything. That's not an option here because really it's not needed. This amp is overall much brighter than the Naylor, and so therefore it's really just not necessary. I guess if you wanted, you could get Dave to put a bright cap on your Naked, like if you really wanted to, but you know, I've never really felt the need for it because it's already a very bright amp. Okay, and then the other thing is that this amp is equipped with a SAT switch, which is this little guy right here. It's the same SAT switch as any other BE, right? Any other of Dave's products, right? I believe it's the same exact SAT switch. Basically, it just puts Zener diodes in the circuit. The master volume level will drop, and you will gain, more compression, more saturation. So it kind of thickens up the sound a lot. I think it's very useful on the Naked specifically, because the Naked is frankly such a dark amp. I'm sorry, dark amp. Such a loud amp, sorry. Such a loud amp. It's a bright amp, not a dark amp. It's such a loud amp. This amp is absolutely insanely, crushingly loud. It is far louder than any of the other Friedmans I've ever owned, even the Jakey Lee, which is loud. Like, the Naked is super loud because it doesn't have a lot of negative feedback. So it's really, really, really loud. Like way more than like the Head First, or I mean, it's as loud as like an old Super Lead, right? I mean, it is loud. Like the cops will get called on it. So I think that switch is actually really useful because it drops the master volume, and it lets you get some of the Naked type tones at lower volumes, right? So I actually think it's pretty useful. But let's go ahead and we can check out the gain channel. We'll cover the diodes more when I get to that. And I'll kind of talk more about what that does. But let's go ahead and check out the gain channel. I mean, this is going to be pretty much the sound, right? I mean, I've got, you know, Tom Anderson pickups with a Naked into Marshall G12 vintage 70 watt speakers. So, I mean, this is, you know, pretty much it. You know, you're looking at it. So let's check it out. So, as you can see, very, very aggressive, right? A very aggressive amp, even much more so than the Naylor, right? Brighter, tighter, still retains that same feel. And that's one of those things that I can't really convey to you through a video, right? The Naylor feel is this kind of like sticky, sort of like uncompressed kind of feel, right? And it's exacerbated with these Tom Anderson pickups, right? And those two together actually make it kind of a little bit difficult to play. Billy Howerdel is actually on record saying that, right? He's talked about like these pickups and the Naked and stuff before and said like, I could probably get pickups that would be a lot easier to play, but I like the stiff feel of these, right? So it's a pretty like unforgiving amp, I would say, the Naked, right? Like it's going to expose your flaws, right, as a player. It's not like a BE or something, right? That's like really compressed, you know, or like a Bogner or something, right? Now, I'm not saying those are bad amps, right? Or like a Cameron maybe is a good amp, right? Camerons are really notorious for being super easy to play, right? Like the joke is if you buy a Cameron, you get 5 years better as a player, right? Like this is the opposite, right? It's more like a wizard, right? Where like it's going to be a little bit difficult to play. That's why though, I think the compression that comes from the SAT switch is actually so important. And that's why I think it's really, really useful with this amp. But before I get into that, I just want to cover the presence control, because the presence control on the Naked is super important. So unlike the presence control on the Naylor, where it's like pretty much you just dime it and forget about it 90% of the time, right? The presence control on the Naked is much wider spanning. You can make the amp really dark like the Naylor by turning the presence down. So let me show you that. I'll go back to where I was. So here's where we were. This is about 6. I'll turn it up all the way, or close to all the way. So the presence control on this amp is really, really sensitive and really, really important, because as you can hear, it really wildly changes the sound, right? From like super dark to like really bright, and really kind of everything in between. I actually tell people, I don't think the EQ on the amp is as important nearly as the presence control. You know, it's really a very, very important feature on the amp, right? I would almost set the presence first and then set your EQ, right? And my EQ for the most part is pretty much at noon. I've got the mids at 6, bass and treble at 5, right? And the gain is at 6, I think, or maybe like 6.5, right? So nothing super crazy. If you want to see how much gain this channel has, I can show you real quick. So I'll turn the gain up all the way and we'll check it out. It'll start to get a little bloated, FYI. I don't usually turn the gain up on this amp to 10, because it just tends to get a little flubby. This amp does have a good amount of low end punch, so let's check it out. gets a little tubby on the low end, right? So I don't usually leave it up that high. Honestly, at like 6 or so, this amp has plenty of gain. I mean, there's really not a need. I mean, you could crank it to 7 or 8 and it's fine, you know, but you really don't need to put it on 10, especially with, and this brings us to, the SAT switch. So the SAT switch, I feel like, is really useful on this amp because, like I said, this amp can be a little bit difficult to play at times, right? Especially when you're playing with the Tom Anderson pickups, right? With other guitars, it's more forgiving. But these pickups are unforgiving and this amp is unforgiving. So when you combine them, you get a really cool sound, right? And that's that Billy Howardell sound, that perfect circle sound. But it's kind of difficult to play. And if you're used to playing more compressed amps like, Mesa Boogies or Diesels or, even just like if you're used to using compressor pedals or, you know what I mean? It's just a little bit nice to sometimes have the ability to get an easier under the finger feel with this amp. And it also gets you a little bit of extra added gain and saturation since this is a very raw sounding amp, right? So it kind of smooths out some of the rough edges of the amp as well. So let's go ahead and check it out. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it on and I'm gonna raise the master because when you engage diodes in the circuit, the volume drops. And like I said before, that does make the master on this a much more effective. So let's go ahead and I'm gonna turn the master up to maybe like, 5 or so here. And we'll check it out. I'm actually going to also lower the gain slightly. Sorry, I almost forgot. I'm going to lower the gain to 5, and let's see how it sounds, just because it's going to be a pretty big gain increase. So as you can hear, the amp got a lot darker. I usually have to re-EQ the amp when I put the diodes in. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the treble up a bit, and I'm going to turn the presence up a little bit, and let's see how we're doing now. See, it takes on a little bit of a different character with the SAT switch engaged, right? It gets a little bit darker, a little bit smoother, right? The like I said, the rough edges and the highs and lows kind of get smoothed out. The mid-range becomes a bit more elastic, right? And the feel of the amp changes. It becomes a lot easier to play solos on, that sort of thing. So I think it's a really good thing. Like if you want to use this amp to record, and then you want to do a solo, and you figure you find like, oh, I can't get the right kind of compression out of the amp or whatever, you can just flip the switch. So I think it's pretty cool. I think it's a really, really, really nice addition, and I would recommend if you get a Naked, having that done because I think it's a really powerful change to the amp. So that pretty much covers it, right? That's the amp. I mean, that's what it is. That's why it exists. And frankly, that's why I love it so much, right? I mean, I really love both the Naylor and the Naked. I think they are both great. I really look at them as sort of like, in conclusion, I would say this, right? The Naylor is like a more vintage voiced version of that sound, and the Naked is much more like a modern voiced version of that sound. You get what I'm saying? Like of the Naylor sound, right? Like the Super Drive is like a more vintage version and the Naked is more like a modern version, right? It kind of reminds me of like on this head first right here, there's a button that switches you between a vintage mode and a modern mode. That's kind of how I think of these two amps, right? It's like this is like vintage mode, this is like modern mode. Now that's not to say that this can't be a lethal sounding modern amp, right? But I'm just telling you that like when you're comparing these two together, right? This one is going to sound a little more like old school and this one is going to sound a little bit more like, oh yeah, this is the modern amp, right? This thing is big and nasty, right? So, the bad news about these amps is that they're very difficult to get. So that's the other thing I will warn you about. Naylors take a really long time right now. I think the wait is about 2 years as of the recording of this video. I messaged David King a while back about one. He told me that it would be 18 months minimum, more likely to be 24. Which is why I bought this one used. And I like this one a lot because it actually has a silver sparkle head shell, which I told you about at the beginning, which I think is very cool. So the bad news is like the wait times on these are really long for a new one. If you find an old one, you should buy it immediately if you're interested because they will not last long. This one was for sale for a day before I bought it, right? And there were other people commenting in the thread saying that they wish they could buy it and they're interested in buying it, and you know, so it's gonna sell really quick. The Naked, unfortunately, is even worse. You can't get a new Naked. You just can't. They're not in production anymore, so you'd have to buy a used one. There is a run of Nakeds that Dave is supposedly doing. I have been on the list since May of 2021, so that's over 2 years at the time of making this video. And I don't mean this in a nasty way, that Dave can take his time or whatever, but like, I don't think there's any ETA in sight, right? Like, I don't think he's like sitting there saying, oh yeah, well, it'll be done, you know, next month or something. So, I'm just waiting for his phone call one day, you know, with my credit card to buy another one, because I love them so much. So if you see a Naked used, definitely buy it, right? I mean, don't think. If you think, it'll be gone. Every Naked I've ever seen for sale is almost always gone within a day or two, right? Like they're gone almost immediately. So I would say if you see one, buy it. Going price for these right now is pretty high. I mean, to be honest with you, it's probably something like, you know, depending, could be anywhere from like $4,000 to $5,000 to $7,000, you know, $4,000 to $7,000. The ones like this that say Friedman and stuff that are like in the newer head shell, this is still a Mark I, it's a 2012 from the first run, but these ones are worth a little less. The ones that are in the Marshall looking head shells from like 2009, 2010, those ones are generally worth more and come on the market much more rarely. So I would just say if you see one, buy it, right? Like that's the best thing you can do. There's just nothing like these two amps. All the other amps that I own, all the other amps that I've played, and all the gear I've ever had, nothing sounds like a Naylor or a Naked, right? Like a Super Drive or a Naked. Nothing sounds like it. Nothing plays like it. Nothing has the same feel and that same kind of wild sound, you know? So if you love that sound, go get on it, you know? And no, mine are not for sale. People have asked me many times. There's a guy that's like, has asked me, I think like 4 or 5 times this year to sell me the Naked, and I won't. So, all right, guys, thank you for hanging out. Again, this is Mike from Eldorado Guitars. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. It really does help me out. I'm trying to get to 1,000 followers so that I can do live streams with you guys. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your weekend. Peace.